Hey everyone, Jesse here with VMP Performance, and today we're going to show you how to install our Odin kit on your 2018 Plus Mustang GTs. Let's get started. Okay, let's start with taking our battery loose. The first thing you're going to do is remove the 3 clips that hold this cover down. We've already removed ours. Go ahead and take the panel, pull it out of the way. Once that's out of the way, we're going to take the negative terminal loose. It's a 10mm socket. Take that off, set it aside, and now we can safely work on the vehicle. All right, we're gonna start by taking the engine cover off. There's gonna be 2 10mm nuts on each side under 2 black caps. Our vehicle's missing the black caps, but you can pop those off with a flathead screwdriver. Then you're gonna take the oil cap off. Cover comes right off. The next thing we're going to do is remove the intake. We're going to start by removing these 2 hoses. They are both push clamps. We get those off. Then we're going to do our mass airflow sensor. After that, we're going to release the 2 clips on the lid. And then we're going to take a 7mm and release the clamp. After that, we're going to go ahead and pull this loose. Now our sound tube is still attached. So we're gonna pop the clip right here and then give it a good tug and it'll come off the stud in the back. All right, now we're gonna remove the lower intake. There's gonna be a 10mm bolt here on the side. Once you get that loose, the whole thing comes right out. Our next step, we're going to take the 2 bolts that hold the Degas bottle down. We're going to move that out of the way. Okay, now we're going to remove our factory breathers. We will reuse these, so go ahead and set these aside. Now we're going to remove our aspirator assembly and the covers for the fuel rails, get those out of the way, and then we'll be ready to take our intake manifold off. Start by removing the 10mm nuts. We can position our purge valve out of the way. Take your aspirator loose. We're going to remove it completely and hang on to this because we will reuse this section later on for the rest of the install. Now we can position our heater hoses out of the way, remove the brackets and the foam covers for the fuel rails. You're going to do this on both sides. Now we can go ahead and unplug the throttle body. All right, next we can unplug all of our connections over here. We'll start with the fuel rail pressure sensor. Then we'll move on to the injectors. Once those are unplugged, we can move to our fuel feed line. You're going to want to wrap something around the line. There will be pressure in the line. You don't want to spray your eyes. Go ahead and release the clip. Cover the line and then give it a pull. Wait a minute, you can audibly hear the pressure releasing. Once you hear it slow down, you can go ahead and remove your covering. Now we can move to the passenger side where we're going to do the same thing. Go ahead and plug all the injectors. And then we can release this fuel line. You're going to use your special tool here. Release the line. It's going to dribble a little bit. And then set that aside. Take note, this line goes on a specific way. There is a check valve in the line. If you do install it backwards, you will have drivability issues. The metal connection goes to the rail. The plastic connection goes directly to the DI pump. Now we can go ahead and remove the bolts that hold the intake manifold down. There's going to be 10 total. There are 4 10 millimeters and 6 8 millimeters. We'll start by removing the 10 millimeter bolts. And now we can remove the 8 millimeter bolts. Now we can lift the manifold out of the way to unplug our IMRCs. There's going to be one plug on the top, one plug in the back, and then there's another plug down lower. The harness is also clipped onto the manifold in 2 different spots. You're going to want to release those with a trim tool, and then you can lift the manifold out of the way. 1, 2, and 3. Now we can remove the accessory belt. It's going to be a 15 millimeter wrench. We will reuse this belt, so set it aside. Now the AC stretch belt we will not be reusing, so you can take that off the factory way or you can cut it out of the way. Since we're not reusing it, cut it out of the way and remove it. Now we can go ahead and remove the water pump pulley bolts. These are going to be a 10 millimeter. You can break these loose while you have the belt still on to hold some tension on it, and then once the belt is off, remove the bolts. Take the pulley out of the way. Next, we're going to move on to benchtop assembly for your Odin kit. The first thing we're going to have to do is remove the lid. That way you can actually bolt it to the car. We're going to remove the lid, install the fuel rails, install the IAT sensor, and the map block offs. So let's get started by taking the lid off. After we've removed the 18 10 millimeter bolts, we're going to lift the lid off. You're going to want to lift it straight up and out of the way. There is a gasket under the lid. We don't want to tear the gasket. Our next step is going to be assembly of the fuel rails and installation of our injectors. When you get your fuel rails, you want to make sure that you take out each plug, lube them with a little bit of super lube, and then make sure they're all tight. There's going to be 2 on the end, 4 down the sides. One of them is open for your fuel rail pressure sensor, and then you're going to have 2 3/8 quick connect fittings and the line that crosses through the back. We've already gone and tightened all of our fittings. We're going to install our injectors and get the rails installed on the blower. Now, depending on the injector you use, it may or may not need the hat. The FIC 1000s in this application do not need the hat, so you can go ahead and remove them. You're going to do that on all 8 injectors. Now with our hats removed, we're going to lube up the O-rings. You just need a little bit on each side. Insert it into the rail. You're going to make sure that the plug faces outwards so we can plug them in when they're on the car. Now with all 8 of our injectors installed, we can install the fuel rail to the blower. You're going to make sure that the crossover is on the rear of the blower. You're going to get the rail in place, give it a little wiggle, and make sure that the O-rings seat into the buckets. Now we can install the hardware that holds our fuel rails to the blower. There's going to be 3 bolts on each side. We're going to install all 3 on the passenger side. And on the driver's side, we're just going to install the middle bolt. The other 2 will get installed in the car when we put the bracket for our brake booster hose back on. We're going to leave this one a little loose for now. That way we can put the other 2 bolts in when we get to the vehicle. Now we're going to install the fuel rail pressure sensor. You're going to remove this from your OEM fuel rail, and we're going to find the copper washer provided in the kit, install that, and then we're going to put it right here on the fuel rail. This is going to be a 1 1/16 wrench. Give it a little snug. It does not need to be super tight. Now we can install our IAT sensor and our map block-offs. There's going to be one in the back. The IAT sensor goes on the other side, and the second map block-off goes in the front of the blower. Make sure you lube the O-ring for ease of installation. And then go ahead and install it into the back of the blower. Now we can take our plug, put a little Loctite on the threads to seal it. Use a 5mm Allen. We're going to install it in the hole just above the map block off. Now we can install our brass IAT sensor. Again, we're going to put a little Loctite on the threads to seal it. It's going to be a 19mm wrench. This is going to go pretty tight, and that should do it for us. When you install the IAT sensor, you want to make sure that the sensor actually reaches the airstream. So go in deep enough to reach the airstream, make sure it's tight, and you're good to go. All right, after the sensor is installed, we're going to take the harness from the same kit and plug that in, simply because it's hard to plug in on the car. Take it for now, stuff it in here, that way you can set the blower on the vehicle and then you can route the line. Now we're going to take our second mat block off, lube the O-ring, and we're going to install that on the inlet of our supercharger. Next, we can install our Evap Adapter. All right, and with that installed, we're ready to set the blower on the vehicle. Now we're gonna lower our coolant level because we do have to remove the 2 heater hoses. We're gonna achieve this with our MightyVac fluid pump. If you do not have access to one of these pumps, you can also go to the bottom passenger side of the radiator and remove the drain plug to lower the level. All right, now for this next step, we're gonna replace the heater tubes. We're gonna show you these on a mock-up engine just for ease of installation and visibility for your engine. So in the kit, you're gonna have 2 heater tubes, one for the passenger side and one for the driver's side. Go ahead and start by removing the 8mm bolt that holds the heater tube in. You're gonna remove that. You're gonna take the driver's side heater tube, make sure you got a little lube on the O-ring, and put it in place. Put the bolt back in. And we're gonna do the same thing on the passenger side. Remove the bolt, remove the pipe. Again, lube your O-ring. Put it into place. Now on this side, the hole is slotted. So when you put the bolt back in, you can rotate the pipe a little bit to suit your needs. Tighten the bolt back up. And the heater pipe is installed. Now we're going to show you how to modify the heater hose to attach to your driver's side heater pipe. All right, on the driver's side, you're going to take the supplied quick connect fitting. You're going to take the heater hose supplied in the heat exchanger kit. Connect these together. You're going to use the Gates power clamp here. Use the heater hose to attach it. Attach it right to your heater tube here. Make sure you're seated. Then you're going to run this along the side of the valve cover, and we're going to attach it with a 3/4 splice to the heater hose. Now on the driver's side, we're going to have to splice and extend the heater hose. So what we're going to do is route it along the bottom side of the valve cover, and then we're going to take our hose cutters. We're going to cut it about right here by the first coil. Now we can stick our extension in to attach to the factory heater tube. I'm going to cut it about right here. Once we've trimmed it, we can attach our 3/4 splice. Then we can attach it to the existing heater hose. Move the clamp into position, and we are done. Now in order to set the blower down, we're also going to have to move the harness out of the way on either side. You're just going to release the harness quick connects all the way back. Pull it back. You're going to do the same thing on the passenger side. Next, we're going to remove the overflow hose and replace it with the one provided in the kit. Next thing we have to do is bend the nipple from the coolant outlet. You're going to bend it ever so slightly just to clear the front inlet of the blower. Okay, now that the hose is off, you're going to take the 2 clamps. We're going to reuse those on the provided hose. Okay, now that this hose is installed, we can set the bottle aside yet again, and we can install our head unit. Okay, now that the blower is in place, we're not going to bolt it down yet. There's a couple things we have to do. We're going to plug in all the injectors, we're going to plug in the fuel lines, we're going to route some of our harnesses. That way it all lays nice and pretty when we're ready to actually bolt the blower down. So we'll start with plugging in the injectors on the passenger side. Now we can plug in the driver's side injectors. All right, now before we move on, we're going to route this harness. We're going to go under the fuel line. We're going to run that forward. We're going to move this harness under the fuel line as well, under the fuel rail pressure sensor. Once those are in place, we can do a couple things. We can plug in our fuel rail pressure sensor, and we can plug in our fuel line. Set the blower back down, and we're ready to bolt the blower down to the engine. Okay, now we can plug in our fuel line on this side. Now we can bolt the blower down. You want to make sure you look inside and see that the blower is actually sitting on the surface of heads and it's not being held up by the wiring harness in any place. I'm going to take the supplied hardware pack and insert the bolts into the blower. There's going to be 5 on the inside. On the driver's side, there's going to be 4 on the inside of the passenger side and 1 external bolt on the passenger side. That external bolt is going to be located on the front just behind the heater pipe. All right, now that all the bolts are started, we're going to go through, make sure we're not pinching a wiring harness anywhere, and then we can give them their final torque before we set the lid on. All right, now that the blower is bolted down, we can put our lid on. You want to be careful that you do not tear the gasket. So you're going to come over the top and set the lid straight down. Before you put the bolts in, you want to do a quick walk around and make sure that the gasket is still in place, and then reinstall the hardware that you removed when you took the lid off for the bench assembly. Next we can take the aspirator assembly that we removed earlier. We're going to keep this section all the way up to the aspirator. We're going to remove the clamp. And remove the hose. And we're going to get rid of this part. This part will be installed on the side of the blower, reconnect to the booster, and attach to the inlet. Okay, now that we have this section, we're actually going to swap the hoses from side to side to give us a better routing on the blower. All right, now that we've swapped our hoses side to side, we're ready to stick this in place. Before we bolt this down, you're going to want to make sure the holes are lined up and tighten this center bolt. We're not going to have access to this once this piece is installed. All right, now we can take our 2 leftover bolts from the bench installation and bolt the bracket down. A little longer bolt. Okay, now that the pipe is in place, we can go ahead and plug in our brake booster hose. And then on the other side, we can hook this right up to the inlet. Make sure to put the clamps back in place. Once your clamps are in place, you are done with this section. Next thing we can do is attach the hose for our purge valve. You're going to want to cut the quick connect side off of this. You can use a razor. Once you remove that, you're going to use the provided length of hose. Stick it right onto the purge valve on this side. And then you're going to run the other side directly under the inlet. And now make sure the purge valve is plugged in. We can move to the other side and I'll show you where to attach it. Once you're on the other side, you're going to take your hose, route it away from the pulley, cut it to length, and then we're going to attach it right here onto the plate that we bolted on earlier. Once that's in place, you're done. The next thing we're going to do is install our throttle body. Now inside of your throttle body package there is going to be a hardware kit. You're going to find the 4 bolts for this installation and we're going to install those with the gasket. What you're going to want to do is make sure that the gasket does not pinch out in any section. You can look through the blades of the throttle to see if the gasket is pinched out, and then we're going to torque all the bolts down. Okay, now that our evap and blower install is pretty much wrapped up, we can move on to our belt drive. The first thing we're gonna do is install our boomerang bracket. This bracket is gonna hold all of our idlers. This installs in this area. We're gonna remove these 3 bolts and then replace it with the supplied bolts that come with the boomerang. Two out of the 3 bolts are going to go straight through the bracket. The last bolt is going to go through the idler. So you're going to wait to install the last bolt. The last idler will install with the supplied bolt. Okay, now that our boomerang bracket and idlers are installed, we can install our 6-rib idler. We're going to use the factory notch on the timing cover to do this. Tighten that up, and we're done. Now we can install our pulley. The first thing we're going to do is take the hub spacer. We're going to set it in place. Then we can take our pulley and our bolts. Install these. We're going to snug these up for now, and we can get our final torque once the belt is fully installed. Now we're going to install our tensioner and our belt. You can install the belt after the tensioner goes on, however I find it easier to slide the belt over the pulley and then put everything in place. We're going to mount this right in the factory location on the timing cover. Okay, now that the tensioner is in place, we can go ahead and route our belt and install it for the final time. We're going to go up over the tensioner, down around the crankshaft, and up to this idler. On the other side, we're going to go around the AC compressor. Then we're going to go over top of the 6-rib idler, under the upper idler, and then we can release the tension on our tensioner and slide it over our upper pulley. Now your belt is installed. After you release the tension on the belt, you're going to go around and double check that the belt is in position on all pulleys. And now you're ready to go. Now that the belt's installed, we can do the final torque on our pulley bolts. Now that the Supercharger belt is on, we can reassemble our front accessory drive belt. We're going to reinstall our pulley for the water pump. Once again, we're just going to snug these bolts until we can get the belt on, and then we'll do our final torque. Now that the pulley's in place, we can slide our belt in. You can refer to the factory routing for this. This is going to be a 15mm wrench again for the tensioner. Once this is in place and the tension is released, you're going to go back and double check that the belt is seated properly on all the pulleys. Once the belt is on, we'll go back and do the final torque sequence on the water pump pulley bolts. And now the belt drive is done. Now on the passenger side, we can reconnect our heater hose around the edge of the blower. Make sure that the locks lock in place. All right, the first thing we're gonna do when we install our heat exchangers, we're gonna remove this shroud, we're gonna remove the lower covers, and then we can pull the bumper off. We're gonna remove all the push pins that hold this upper cover on. Once these are all loose, give it a light tug. And make sure you catch all your push pins. Good. First thing we're going to do is take the bolts that hold the top of the bumper off. There's going to be 6 8mm bolts, and then there's going to be 2 5.5mm bolts. The next thing we're going to remove are the 2 10mm nuts on each side of the car. These hold the side of the bumper. Once these are removed, we can pull the bumper off. Now that the vehicle is back in the air, we can remove the lower panel. Once the lower panel is off, we can unplug the fog lights, and then we can remove the bumper from the vehicle. There's going to be a couple of push pins on the bottom. One here, and then this can come off. We're going to move to the other side. Remove this push pin, and then the lower panel slides right out. Now we can unplug the fog lights on both sides. Now we can remove the push pin here and the push pin here. Now we can do the same on the other side. Once those two push pins are out of the way, we can lower the car and remove the cover entirely. Now you're going to grab the bumper cover and give it a light tug downwards to release the clip. And you can remove this. You're going to do the same thing on the other side. They are marked side to side, so make sure they go back in the same spots. Once that's out of the way, lift the cover, move it out of the way. All right, now that the bumper is out of the way, we can go ahead and remove our wiring harness from the bumper support. Another thing to note, if you have an active grill, you will remove it for this installation. Leave it unplugged, that will be taken care of in the tune. If you don't have an active grill, you're already one step ahead. Now that all the clips are out of the way, you're going to want to relocate your temperature sensor. So go ahead and pop that off the bottom of the support. We're going to pull it up, and then we'll find a spot for this as soon as the heat exchanger is in place. The next thing we're going to do is remove the 4 bolts on the inside of the bumper support. So a 13mm socket. We're going to save 2 of these bolts. We're going to use them to mount the intercooler pump Z bracket. Now we can take the hardware from our heat exchanger kit. We're going to start 2 bolts on each side. Now we're going to put our heat exchanger in place, and then we'll run the bolts in to catch it. All right, now we can stick our heat exchanger in the grill. Go ahead and start your bolts and make sure that they catch the hardware on your heat exchanger. Now we can put the nuts and the washers on the back side. Now to get the heat exchanger in place, it may be necessary for you to trim some of the plastic panels on the bottom. You're going to want to fit it in place and see what you need to cut it, and then you can do your final fitment of the heat exchanger. Each bolt that you put in to hold the heat exchanger is going to take a washer and a nut on the back side. Stick those in place, 13mm, make sure they get tight, and then you're good to go. The next thing we're going to install is our dual relay heat exchanger harness. We're going to start from the bottom of the car, then we'll move into the engine bay. We'll get this routed, and then we can do our hoses. I'll show you how to set the hoses up on the bench, then we'll move to the car. After that, we install our intake, and we're all done with the install. This end is going to plug into our intercooler pump, which will be mounted in this area. So we're going to swap over here, start with the fans. Plug the fans in, then we'll move up to this area to mount the relays. You're going to locate the 3 factory grounds. We're going to mount relay, ground, relay. We'll start with the bottom. Make sure you mount the relay on top of the factory ground, not underneath the factory ground. Then you'll locate the black wire from the kit. And then we can mount the last relay. Once these are in place, we can route the rest of our harness behind the headlight and up into the engine bay. Now we'll move up top and we'll connect to the fuse box. Now we're up top, you're going to locate the instructions that came with your heat exchanger harness and the fuse. You're going to go through, look for your year, make, model, and it's going to tell you exactly where to hook the fuse up. So we're going to move to the fuse box. Now that our power wire is run, we can hook up our main power. We're going to attach right here. Take the 10mm nut off. Put our 2 power wires there and reinstall the 10mm nut. Now that that is all in place, make sure that the wire is routed to where it will not pinch, and reinstall the fuse box cover. Now we're going to take our 2 fuses for this system and we're going to zip tie them up to this factory location just so we can access them later. Now we're going to remove these 2 bolts and we're going to replace them with the longer bolts we took out earlier to mount the heat exchanger. This is going to let us mount our Z bracket and mount our intercooler pump. Now we can take the Z bracket supplied with the heat exchanger and the hardware. We're going to mount it right here. All right, now that these are tight, I'm going to bend this out just a little bit. We're going to mount our intercooler pump right here. Now if you're using the Loki kit with the different intercooler pump, it's going to mount on the end of this bracket and you will have to relocate your horns. Since this is an Odin kit with the upgraded pump, we're going to hang it low and we're going to leave our horns in place. Now that your Z bracket is in place, we're going to mount our high flow pump right here on the side. We've got a U-clip in place. We're going to bolt that down. Now as you're bolting it down, make sure that your inlet and your outlet positions are in a desired location. That way when you route your hoses, you do not kink any of your hoses. All right, now that your intercooler pump is in place, we're going to take the supplied 3/4 hose from the heat exchanger. Go ahead and slide it onto the heat exchanger. And then we're going to measure up to the pump, cut our desired length. Then we'll slide our clamps into place. Attach our hose. Make sure once it's installed, there are no kinks. We're gonna put the clamp on. No kinks, now we can move on to the next hose. All right, now we're gonna set up the heat exchanger system. The first thing you'll notice when you open your kit is that you have 6 small hoses and 1 long hose. The long hose is gonna go from the coolant reservoir to the intercooler pump. So set this one aside, we're gonna do this one last. For now, we'll grab the 6 short hoses and we'll start building our hoses. First thing we're gonna do when we set up this hose is we're gonna take a hole saw. We're gonna put a hole right here in line with the hose. Then we're going to run this hose up through the hole and into the engine bay. All right, once that's in place, we'll install our clamp. All right, now we can move on. Last thing you want to do before you go back into the engine bay is verify that you have no kinks in your hose. Okay, so coming up from our heat exchanger, the hose we just routed, we're gonna connect into this Y, and from this Y, we're gonna go to the bottom port of each side. Now it's very important the direction of flow. You want the flow coming in the single out inlet and out of the dual outlet. That way the water will flow evenly to both sides of the intercooler. So you're going to take 2 of your 90-degree hoses, the short ones, and we're just going to mock them up for now. So you're going to put them in place on both sides. And remember, you're going to want to route these in a way that they do not kink. Once you have your routing figured out, you can see where they all intersect. You're going to cut the hoses. You're going to install your Y. Again, make sure that your routing will not let the hose kink. A kink will stop your intercooler flow and will cause problems down the road. Now for the tops, we're not going to use the constant tension clamps. We're going to use the supplied Gates power grip clamps. We're going to do all these at the end at the same time. That way we can heat them all, make sure everything's in place for our final installation of the clamps. Okay, now we can mount our heat exchanger bottle. we're gonna mount it right here. You can go ahead and take this nut off of the strut tower. Okay, now that you've removed the nut, you can take the supplied bracket. You're gonna bolt the bottle to the bracket with the 3 screws supplied with the bottle. Go ahead and tighten this back down. And now your bottle is in place. Okay, now that we're finished with our feed line, we're gonna move on to the return. You're gonna take your 3 leftover hoses. We're gonna start on the passenger side. We're gonna route that hose under the throttle body. On the driver's side, we're gonna route this hose towards the bottle. We can connect these in this area and then move it towards the bottle. So we're gonna go ahead and cut for our Y before we attach to our bottle. Now on the return side, you're gonna put the Y in the opposite direction that you put on the feed. You want both the returns to feed into the inlets and 1 outlet to the bottle. Make sure your outlet to the bottle is the upper nipple on the bottle. All right, we're gonna take our last hose. We're gonna trim a little bit off the top here. Then we're gonna install our clamp. We can put this in place. Once this is in place, we're gonna find the best spot for the hoses to meet each other without kinking. Now that the feed and the return are in place, we can mount our reservoir. Okay, now that the heat exchanger lines are done, we can do a couple things on the front of the motor here. The first thing we're gonna do is plug our throttle body extension in. Plug that in, route that away from the belt, and then we can plug in our throttle body. Once that's plugged in, we're gonna do a couple things up here with zip ties to keep all the hoses off of the pulley. If the hoses hit the pulley, you will have leaks, and we do not want leaks. All right, once we're confident that the hoses and the wiring can't touch the belt, we can move on to a couple other things while we're here. We're gonna make sure that the vacuum line for the bypass valve has been reattached. And we're gonna reattach our breather hoses. It's gonna go from the valve cover directly over to the inlet of the supercharger. Okay, now that all our hoses are in place, we're gonna remove them and slide our power grip clamps on. Now that the clamp is in place, you're gonna use a heat gun. Okay, now that the bottom hose is on, we can install our upper hose. Once you get them all in place, you're going to use a heat gun to shrink them all down. Once you use the heat gun to shrink them down, they should be good. You can move on to the next part of the project. Okay, now we can install our cold air intake. We're going to start with the filter box. Now that the box is in place, we're going to go ahead and slide our filter assembly into it. You're going to make sure that snaps into place. Once that's in place, we'll get our clamps on and tighten those down. Okay, now that our silicone coupler is in place, we're gonna go ahead and install our clamps. Now that the clamps are installed, we can install our mass airflow sensor, and then we're finished with the cold air intake. All right, you're gonna take your mass airflow sensor from your stock intake or whatever intake you have on the car. This is directional, so you wanna make sure that the side with the scoop faces the filter. That's gonna be for incoming air. You're gonna take your screws, put those in. You're gonna take a T20 Torx. Tighten everything up. Okay, now that the mass airflow sensor is in, we're gonna locate the harness that we ran from the back of the car on the IAT sensor, and we're gonna route that underneath the cold air intake. Once we're on the other side of the cold air intake, we're gonna plug this end into the mass airflow sensor, and then you're going to locate the car's harness, and you're gonna plug the other end into the factory harness for the mass airflow sensor. Okay, the last thing we need to do for the cold air is to plug in our breather. We're gonna route that under the hoses on the front, plug it in the back. All right, and then you can plug in the side on the cold air intake. All right, now that our cold air is in place, we can finalize the routing for the feed line from the bottle to the intercooler pump. So we're gonna route it through here. We're gonna look at the length that we need. Cut it to length, then we can slide our clamp on and attach our hose. Once that is in place, you're gonna make sure that the hose is not kinked and put the clamp in its final spot. Now that is the final hose for the heat exchanger system, so we can go ahead and fill it up with water and bleed it and make sure that we are full. We use an airlift to fill the systems here. They vacuum fill. They are not required to fill the systems, but they do a very good job at getting all the air out to start, so that initial prime is very easy. Before we reconnect our battery, we're going to go inside the car. We're going to install our fuel pump booster. Remove the seat. FPDM. Unplug it. Once this is out, remove the styrofoam. This is just sound deadening. Let's take our fuel pump booster, put the Velcro on the back, and mount it right here. First thing we do is remove the sticky. We're gonna place that. We're gonna install our FPDM. I'm going to put the nut here, then we're going to take the ground, put the bolt through the ground, and reinstall the ground. This little tab, you have to shave it. Just take a razor. Avoid cutting your fingers off. Make sure you get enough. Until that plugs in. And you want to do the same thing on the jumper. I'm not very smart. There it goes. Until you can plug it into the car. After this is done, plug this into the jumper. Take all this back to this side and reinstall your seat. When you slide the seat in, you want to make sure you get the seat belts. A nice little trick is to plug them in so you can't lose them. Both sides will click into place, and you are good to go. And for one of our last steps, we're going to reconnect the battery. After we reconnect the battery, we can double check our intercooler system to make sure it's bled, double check all of our coolant connections and everything like that, button our covers up, and then we are ready to load our tune and fire the vehicle up. Have a friend turn the key on while you fill the system. You can see here what good intercooler flow looks like. It's a steady, consistent stream. If you have your hoses kinked in any spot on the car, you will not see flow in the reservoir. If you do not have flow in the reservoir, go back, double check all your connections, make sure the air is bled out until you get flow. Once you have good flow, you can put the cap on and turn the key off. All right, that was our Odin install for the 2018 Plus Mustang GTs. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, go ahead and reach out to our sales and support staff. They can hook you up with an Odin kit for yourself, or they can help you install your Odin kit if you run into any problems. Other than that, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube, Instagram, Facebook channels to check out more Odin-related content and more install videos. Thank you very much.